Hello and welcome to Maverick Dreamers and Thinkers. I'm Chloe Cho. In this day and age, globalization seems to be taking a step back amid so much chaos and geopolitical and trade tensions. That said, the idea of being a global citizen is still very much en vogue, perhaps because the notion is associated with an element of glamour and success. As a growing number of elite and well-traveled describe themselves as global citizens after an overseas stint for work or study, what does life really look like when one is a true global citizen in the sense that you weren't born in your homeland, moved around much of your life, and barely speak your supposed mother tongue? The saying goes, home is where the heart is, but what if no particular place tugs at your heartstrings? Where is home? In an increasingly complicated and mobile world, how do you identify yourself and where do you find your sense of belonging? An issue that's been close to my heart for as long as I could remember because I've been moving around from an early age and often wondered where I fit in. This is a question that's bound to be on the minds of expats worldwide as the numbers swell to 66 million and growing based on industry data. And when including migrants, the figure quadruples to 260 million, according to the United Nations, which would be about the size of the fifth largest country in the world. Take a listen to the fascinating stories of four true global citizens, all based in Singapore, a cosmopolitan city-state where foreigners account for nearly 40% of its 6 million population. Do note that full names are being withheld for privacy or compliance reasons.
Jambo, Jambo Bwana, habari gani? Nzuri sana, wageni wakaribishwa, Kenya yetu hakuna matata. The last phrase would be recognizable because they use it in Lion King. Hakuna matata, which means no worries. I was born in Nairobi, Kenya, and my dad used to work for an NGO that brought him to different countries, and he was helping figure out how to help rural areas learn about hygiene. And that's what brought him to Kenya, and that's where I was born. But when I was a teenager, we moved all to Singapore, and that's where I've been since then. So I've studied here, and I'm working here right now. So technically I'm Indonesian, but I've never actually lived in Indonesia. Still less than 10 years old whenever I would visit Indonesia on prolonged periods. Even then, I would still feel out of place because I wasn't familiar with the language, so it was difficult to interact with family and with relatives. But also while I was in Kenya, I had to go to a local school, so everybody was dark-skinned and I stuck out like a sore thumb. So wherever I went, I always felt like a foreigner, and honestly, that's how it still feels like today. So they speak English in Kenya, so they're pretty bilingual there. But Swahili is what they speak as well. I had to learn it in school, but it was difficult for me if your family doesn't speak it, and if everybody naturally speaks English to you because they see you're a foreigner. It makes it's difficult to learn a language if you're not forced into speaking it all the time.
You must be bilingual. Swahili and English.
You would think, right? But because it was so easy to speak English at that time, all I can speak right now is English. And I'm not even good in Indonesian either. Funny thing is I'm learning Indonesian now, and everybody is just a bit puzzled as to why an Indonesian is taking Indonesian classes, but that's because I've been out of Indonesia for a while, only visiting from time to time. So, but I do have interests in Indonesia as the country that my family's from. So I do want to learn the language and kind of go back to my roots.
That definition of the word roots, my roots, I mean, that comes into question. What do you think your roots are nowadays?
That's really tough. I've spent a lot of time in Singapore, so I feel at home here more than anywhere else. But just like you said, I always feel like an outsider no matter what.
Meet Jessica, a 31-year-old professional who's lived in Singapore since she was 15. She struggled with being an outsider for much of her life, yet missed her itinerant upbringing so much into adulthood, she ditched her promising career in her late 20s as a business television producer, plunked down her entire life savings for graduate studies in international relations to pursue her dreams of becoming a roaming diplomat. Once she followed her passion full-heartedly, however, she faced an unexpected stumbling block that she had least expected.
Don't you think life is coming full circle? Because maybe you might have not liked the kind of life your parents gave you because you never had a sense of belonging, and yet we end up recreating that ourselves?
I think so, yeah. So the funny thing is, I'm actually interested in diplomacy because I have this diverse background and I feel like I can understand an outsider's perspective more. But the irony is that for diplomacy, you need to represent a country, and I've not been able, I can't do that because even though my passport's Indonesian, I can't really speak. I didn't grow up there. I don't really know the culture. And also for, I was born in Kenya, but I can't represent Kenya either. And I lived a long time in Singapore. I have friends here. And that doesn't mean that I can represent Singapore either.
So in your case, your nationality is literally a passport, a card that gets you around because you don't have psychological, emotional, real affiliation, right? Because in order to be a diplomat, you need to be part of a government entity, right? And in which case you're sort of somewhere in the middle.
To be a diplomat, you kind of need to be thoroughly representative of whichever country, of that country. So that's where I'm lacking. But at the same time, because of this global citizen position that I'm in, that's exactly why I'm interested in international affairs and diplomacy. So, I mean, yeah, this where I'm at now, which is the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, I do get to talk to people in the region, in the various countries in the region, and try to foster kind of collaboration and dialogue.
Do you almost feel like you're always desperately seeking who you are, and yet never quite getting the answer?
I think in terms of identity and in terms of nationality, I feel, yes, that might be elusive. But when it comes to me as a person, and in terms of my identity, I still feel secure. Like, I don't feel like I'm always missing something. I think it's dependent on my faith and because of what I believe. So on one hand, my identity is kind of secure and defined by what I believe. But also on the other hand, yeah, in terms of nationality or like country loyalty, I don't think I'd be able to ever get that. Yeah.
In Japanese, there's a phrase called chuto hampa, which means neither here, neither there. Which, as I say, I think there's many benefits to it, but also some challenges that come along the way.
Pensive and dynamic, Roe is an early 40s C-level executive at a large multinational corporation. Most would have difficulty pinning down his origins because of his exotic appearance as well as his cosmopolitan demeanor. Born in Kobe, Japan, his family, led by both his maternal and paternal grandfathers, fled the violence of the Indo-Pakistani War of 1947 to 1948 over Jammu and Kashmir. His family migrated to Kobe, which boasted the largest Indian community in Japan at the time, until the 1970s. Many, including Roe's grandparents, were drawn by post-war Japan's economic prosperity to pursue business opportunities in textiles, electronics, automobiles, sundries, as well as in real estate management, a tradition that harks back to the 19th century when Japan opened its ports to trade.
I've lived in 7 countries. I have a passport, an Indian passport, but never really lived in India. Was born in Kobe, Japan. My parents, both sets of grandparents are Indian, and we all have our Indian nationality.
How did you guys end up in Japan?
Go back a little bit in history. 1947, there was the partition where India and Pakistan were formed. My family is a Hindu family. They were living in what is now the Pakistan side of the border, and so they had to pick up and leave. And they come from a community of businessmen, merchants, so they had to pick up and leave. And it's actually a very sad part of history because, over 1 million people died in that exchange. It's not talked about very much, but when there was this migration of people, both sides, people coming from what is now Pakistan to India, India to Pakistan, there was a lot of lives lost. And it was at that time that both my grandfathers on both sides decided that, hey, if we're going to pick up and leave everything, why don't we just leave properly? And they ended up going and settling in Kobe, Japan, of all places. And the idea was really that pioneering sort of attitude to say, we know how to do trade, we know how to import, export, and it just so happens that they ended up in Kobe, Japan. My father and all his siblings grew up in Kobe, Japan.
So you had an entire community around you in Kobe, Japan.
We did. And then from there on, that was always base for us. And from there on, the family then established, you can call it trading offices or satellite offices. And for that reason, the family picked up and moved to different countries for these short stints. So we lived in Taiwan, we lived in Nigeria, Africa. We lived in Delhi for a couple of years. That's the only time I've actually lived in India. Moving around quite a lot, but then ended up back in Kobe, Japan, finished high school.
International schools or local schools?
International schools. And it was always sort of the American system, which sort of will explain the way I speak. After that, ended up in the U.S. For university. And in between spent some time in Hong Kong as well. Now in Singapore, and have been here for over 20 years.
When you were in Delhi, how old were you? And what did you feel like?
I would have been 6 or 7 years old. And it's an interesting story. That was the one time we traveled as a family, not for the main family business of trading, but my father decided to open up the Wimpy's, the first Wimpy's fast food restaurant in Delhi, India. He took a franchise out of London. You may know Wimpy's. It was the sort of 1970s, 80s equivalent of McDonald's at the time. And that was fun, and we did for a couple of years, and then ended up back in Japan. When
you were living in Kobe, Japan, I guess that must have felt home, right?
It did at the time. But, being a non-Japanese person in Japan has its pros and cons. There is always this underlying feeling that you don't belong. But it is a very close part of all of us, the food, the people, the environment, the safety, which may be, one of the underlying reasons I've ended up in Singapore, because it's such a safe place to be.
You go from one super safe place to another super safe place.
It's convenient. It's convenient. But it's also interesting because you have, again, pros and cons to having lived in so many different places. The benefits, I think, are spoken about widely: being flexible, being easy to sort of adapt to things, being tolerant to different types of views, people, races, cultures, etc. So all that is really good, and I believe it's helped me sort of frame my thinking in a global mindset, both personally and professionally. But there are some disadvantages, I think, that come with that, from being so mobile and having this nomadic life, which is perhaps one of confusion, perhaps one of kind of a lack of belonging, perhaps a feeling of isolation at times, of, where do I really fit in?
Do these questions about one's identity and a sense of belonging get magnified when biracial parents are thrown into the mix? That's the case of Karen, an attractive and competent mid-30s executive who works for a multinational corporation in Singapore. Her father is British and her mother hails from South Korea.
Global citizen, for me, means you have multiple homes in your lifetime. So, and that phrase, home is where the heart is I think is really true. So it doesn't have to be one location, and it can change depending on where your family is at the time as well. So, for example, I was born in Korea. Lived there till I was about 8 years old. Then we moved to Salisbury in the UK. Was there for about 4 years. Then Surabaya in Indonesia for about 5 years. And then that's where I finished high school and then went on to university in London. And my parents stayed behind in Surabaya in Indonesia. And they actually stayed in Indonesia for a total of 20 years. While my brother and I were in London for university and then started our careers there. And during that time, I would say, obviously, London was my new home, and I was there for 10 years before I moved to Singapore. But equally, because my parents lived in Indonesia, Indonesia was also my home. So I had two homes at one time.
Your story is kind of similar with mine in a sense that when I was growing up in the U.S., I felt like America was my home. And then when I moved back to Korea, I felt like Korea became my home, but not quite. And then now I'm in Singapore. I guess Singapore is my home. So I guess it's kind of just like an evolving theme in your life. You don't really have a great personal attachment, emotional attachment to any one particular place.
It's where you're currently sort of present, and depending on how long you spend in one place. So Singapore is now my home. I've been here for 8 years and no plans to leave anytime soon, at least. But before this, London was my home for 10 years, and that was the longest stretch that I had lived in any country. So 10 years is the maximum number of years so far. So, Singapore should sort of tip that. And half my life has been in Asia, and the other half has been in the UK. But yeah, you just kind of make it work.
When you were growing up, did you have any grudges against your parents saying, why are we moving around so much? Didn't you want to feel grounded at some point?
Definitely. I think especially, before your teenage years and your teenage years. So I remember, I don't really remember moving or being too sad about moving from Korea to Salisbury in the UK, because I think I was a bit too young. But I do remember being in England and moving to Indonesia, and I was really quite upset about that because I felt that I had started to settle.
These are the critical years when you start having friends. You could do slumber parties as a young girl.
Definitely. And then also moving to somewhere that you didn't even know existed. So my dad had to show me where Indonesia was on the map, and it was it's really, really far from the UK. And then also explaining to my friends at the time, oh yeah, I'm going to be moving to Indonesia, and they're like, what is that? And then showing them in school on the map. So it's definitely tough because you have to then readjust to, a new life, a new culture, and new friends.
Did you ever feel like you belonged to any group?
Not really. But then I think I was also okay with that. And depending on where I lived, again, sort of, I guess you don't think about it when you're young. But in the UK, then obviously being half Korean, half English, a little bit different, and then not having lived in the UK prior to getting there, you do feel a little different. But I think at that age, you just adapt, and kids don't really question that much. It's probably more the teenage years. But then I would say I was fortunate enough to be in an international school where pretty much everyone was different.
And when you were single, did you have difficulties relating to somebody, meeting somebody? Because which side do you choose?
On the positive side, when you don't go for one, then you have more options. Options are good. But it can be a little bit tricky depending on like where that other person is from and what they're exposed to in their life and how comfortable they are with all of this. Because, you know, if you're just used to living in one place, growing up there, and then maybe, you know, being in Singapore, it's your first sort of stint away, and these are all new experiences, it's kind of quite different from someone who's kind of been doing it all their life.
Does that throw some men off? Did that happen to you when you were single and trying to look for a partner? You know, because these experiences, your experiences, can intimidate the opposite sex.
I have had someone say, you know, sort of in a jokingly way, like a guy, he's actually a lawyer, that said, oh, you know, of course a guy wouldn't find you intimidating, but through sarcasm. So I guess so, because, you know, traveling a lot, having lots of stories, and those stories involving different experiences in different countries can be quite sort of, you know, foreign to some people.
Karen got married 2 years ago to a well-traveled New Zealander after a couple of years of courtship and recently gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, Sophia. When it came time to register Sophia's nationality, she was startled to find out that her daughter was only able to take on the nationality of New Zealand, not dual citizenship of both Britain and New Zealand.
It raised a lot of questions once you guys had a kid. Which passport are we going to get for our little young girl, Sophia? Where do we want to live? All these questions that you didn't think before when you were a single or just a couple came up.
Yeah, definitely. And we're still trying to kind of figure all that out now. It does add another dimension to the mix. But it is a little bit complicated. But then again, because this has been life, and then it's just kind of how we're going to navigate that going forward. So Singapore is a happy medium between Europe and New Zealand for our families. I think it's a great place to, you know, raise young kids. But yeah, that question of, you know, sort of where in the long term, we don't have an answer to that right now.
It's difficult to build a vision when you don't know where home is. When you had a Sophia less than a year ago, and you're on maternity leave now, it raised a lot of questions. So even though you carry a British passport, since you were foreign born, and the same for your father, who was born in Rhodesia when it was part of the Great British Empire, then it became a bit tricky, right?
My dad's parents immigrated from the UK to Rhodesia, and then had my dad there. So he was born out of the UK, and then so was I, as you've just said. And so I cannot pass on the British citizenship just like that to Sophia. So that's something that we're trying to sort of navigate through now, because my mum actually... she was naturalized, so she's actually British. So she gave up her Korean passport when we were in the UK after like the 4th year of living there. So she's, you know, rightfully British. So it just becomes a lot complicated because, you know, let's say, yeah, if I wasn't British, say if I was Korean, then I would have gotten naturalized at that point, and then, you know, Sophia would have had a rightful claim to be a British citizen.
Rhodesia was a British colony in southern Africa until it gained independence in 1980 and became Zimbabwe. The complications of different continents and cultures are equally mirrored in the story of Fabien, or Fabien. Unlike Karen, who comes from mixed racial heritage, Fabien is ethnically Chinese but was born and raised in France, and French is his mother tongue.
Je m'appelle Fabien.
My name is Fabien. I was born in Paris, in the 11th district, grew up in Paris, and also started work in Paris, before coming to Singapore for work nearly 10 years ago.
A successful 40-year-old investment banker turned entrepreneur, Fabien moved to Asia for the first time in his late 20s. He spent the first few years in Hong Kong before moving to Singapore. Well-traveled and well-dressed, his high-end lifestyle strikes a contrast with the turbulence that his family had to endure after fleeing Cambodia in 1973. His family originates from Shantou, China, but were living in Cambodia when the Khmer Rouge orchestrated a military coup in 1970. Fabien's grandfather courageously led half of the family out of Phnom Penh in 1973 amid civil unrest, 2 years before the Khmer regime took control. They first settled in Bangkok, Thailand, before making their way to France with whatever they had to embark on a new life. The other half of the family that remained in Cambodia were among the 2 million people who perished in one of the worst genocides of the 20th century.
I was born in France, but my parents are Cambodian Chinese, so they migrated to France. And I was born and I grew up in France. And actually, the complication came only when I came to Singapore about 10 years ago. In France, I never had a complication like that before, because here it's a very multi-ethnic, multi-racial society. But in France, you are French, irrespective of your race, irrespective of where your parents are coming from.
It's interesting that you say that you felt more accepted in your native France rather than somewhere like Singapore, where the Chinese are the majority.
I saw less of a difference in France than in Singapore, because the concept that French people are trying to remove is the race concept, which is idealistic. I agree, but this is more of a taboo. Whereas in Singapore, it is more calling a spade a spade society, whereby you are defined by your racial ethnicity.
You're either Chinese, Malay, Indian, or others, right?
I think when you grow up in Asia, you are somehow there's more a consciousness of your racial ethnicity compared to the West.
Did you have to defend your French identity to a lot of the Chinese people in Asia?
Now I'm embarrassed. So in the first few years when I was in Singapore, people were asking me, where were you from? I said, naturally I'm French. But now actually, now understanding better the environment, I don't know what to answer anymore. And I'm sometimes feeling embarrassed to say I'm French, because people could be thinking, you are saying you're French because you want to differentiate yourself, to somehow put yourself under a better light. But it's not the case at all. It's more like, that's my reality at least. But when it's exposed to other people, they just think about it as a way of me of promoting myself, which I've never thought that way. I embrace very well my Chinese culture, and that's maybe why actually I've never felt any difference when I was in France, because I know that some other people in France from other ethnicities or other Chinese, they're rejecting sometimes their identity, and as a result they're more conscious of this aspect. For me, maybe I'm an odd one out, but I've never thought of it that way at all. I mean, in the most honest manner.
Maybe it simply takes a bit of time for many people in Asia to register that your journey has been very different. In fact, halfway around the world from them. French is your mother tongue, but how good is your Chinese? Teochew is your ethnicity, right?
I can speak my dialect very well with my parents, but when it comes to Mandarin, it's just socially. But I'm taking up classes as well.
Given your complex background, do you have difficulties in identifying who you can strike up friendships or even relationships with? Because it's all about who do you identify yourself with and who do you associate yourself with?
It's with people that are more open-minded, less judgmental, just naturally, because they are understanding better better situations, that people come from different backgrounds.
You've made quite a career here in Asia Pacific as an investment banker turned entrepreneur. Did you ever find that your complicated background made it difficult to break into the market? Because at the end of the day, a lot of big deals happen in China, Hong Kong, and within the Chinese community in Southeast Asia.
Possibly. That's why it's very important to me not to share too much, because it can attract jealousy or it could be perceived as bragging. So I just tend to be what people want me to be.
What is your answer if anybody asks you, where are you from?
Well, I always say where I'm coming from, but putting more or less emphasis depending on the person. The facts will remain the same, so I'm coming from France, but I'll put more or less emphasis on the real background.
Jessica couldn't agree more, given the backlash she's experienced for much of her life about her perceived identity, in part because of her fair complexion, as well as her Christian beliefs that counter to Indonesia being the world's most populous Muslim country.
When people see my passport and then they realize I can't speak Indonesian, to them it's like a shame. You can feel it. Yeah, sometimes when I go back to visit my parents' school, I think there's a mix. So people are kind of like in awe of the foreigner, but there's also how come you're Indonesian but you don't, relate to us as much? Like, why have you made yourself to be so much of an outsider? Yeah. Also, like I face it here in Singapore as well, where when I couldn't speak Chinese, there was once, and then but the thing is, sometimes I've lived here long enough, so sometimes I do understand what they're saying. Not everything, but they were like, the person tiak kentang, which means the person like eats potato. So it's kind of, it's a little derogatory in saying this person can't speak Chinese, she's just very Western.
Because they see you as Chinese.
So that's the irony, right?
If you were to find a partner, get married, do the whole thing, have kids, do you think the challenges will be greater?
There are things that you have to think about. So, there are quite a number of mixed marriages now, so it works. I did have an experience where people have tried to introduce me to Indonesian guys where they are not as fluent in English, and I'm obviously not fluent in Indonesian, so it was just a disaster waiting to happen. If, like I told you, right, like I think what I'm looking for in a guy is that we can click and have a conversation. If we can't even have a basic conversation, how do we even move forward? But at the same time, like I'm cognizant of if I find someone here in Singapore, for example, if he's Chinese, he would have all these rituals that will come along with marriage, with like pregnancy, everything that I will have to kind of learn and adapt.
While Jessica is reflective about what type of man might be best suited for her, things happen quite easily by chance for Ro. He says that he simply kept an open mind and didn't think too much about it.
So when it came time to dating, as you got into university, as you got started with your life in general, was it tough to choose a partner, a spouse?
I haven't had a particular view on or a requirement, if you like, that one needs to be a certain nationality or have an international background or whatever. I've been very lucky in that my spouse is from the Philippines. Very different from me in that she spent virtually her whole life in Manila in the Philippines, and we met in Singapore through work. And now we have 3 boys. I had the job to go down to register their birth while my wife was recovering upstairs in the delivery room. So I just put down Indian because I didn't know what to do. But it's an interesting story because them growing up here in Singapore, the question for them is even more difficult because, are they Indian? Are they Filipino? or are they Singaporean? And but when I see how they sort of react to it, and albeit they're still quite young, it doesn't seem to faze them at all. And they're growing up in an environment, an international school in Singapore, where lots of people are facing the same situation. So, I don't think they get pressed as much as maybe I got pressed of, where are you really from? And who are you really? So I think that's interesting, and whether or not they have trouble with this or not growing up, we'll see, but I think it'll be probably an advantage to them. And as time goes on, and after every generation, I think we get more and more global. Before we got married, we talked about the prospect of having children, and my wife was pretty clear in that the children will be brought up as good Catholics. Several years later, a real change in the approach. That's not to say that religion is not important, but in fact we think it's very important, and will guide the kids through downtimes, which happen all the time throughout life. But that rigidity, that structure is sort of gone, in the sense that my wife is very happy to expose the kids to both Catholic rituals and Hindu rituals, and we don't have to go to church every Sunday, and the value system becomes kind of more important than just live by that. So I think it's interesting to see how people change and evolve within this context of being global or international.
When you think about retirement, that's kind of the big question mark that people have. Since you don't really have a home, a base, right? And especially if your parents have moved on, it becomes sort of a dilemma for a lot of people. Do you and your wife ever talk about that?
We do talk about it. I think given that we have been here, I've been here for 20 years, Singapore, and it's a place that I have felt the most comfortable. Ideally, we'd like to continue to stay here if we can. But then again, we have the option to be in the Philippines, we have the option to be in India, just because of the passports that we carry. So yeah, that's really up in the air right now, and maybe we'll split our time between all three places.
After spending 20 years in Surabaya, Indonesia, Karen's British father and Korean mother chose to retire in Spain. They traveled to Britain and Singapore to spend time with their children and grandchildren. As Karen gets ready to embark on a new chapter of life, juggling motherhood and career as she returns to work after being away for 8 months, what lies ahead is uncertain. For now, Singapore is home. It's so difficult to look ahead now. There's Brexit. The world continues to change. Asia is constantly in motion. How do you think your life will evolve 10 years from now?
On the personal front, I think because we have families spread all over the world, we'll just continue to travel and see them. And look for opportunities of when we can be sort of closer again. And I guess, depending on how, the economies and things change and job opportunities, that might be the reason for, moving away from Singapore.
Fabien's parents are still in Paris and plan to stay there for good. They regularly travel to London and Singapore to spend time with their children and grandchildren. On the personal front, Fabien is looking to settle down. He says after a few recent breakups, he's now open-minded, just as his grandfather was when he set forth on an unknown journey to Europe almost 50 years ago.
I had very often stereotypes of what I wanted, but I think at this stage of my life, I think, every time I wanted to have something, it didn't turn out working, so now I'm very much more open-minded.
As Jessica gets settled in her new job, she's trying to improve Bahasa Indonesia as part of her efforts to better connect with her roots.
I don't see myself moving to Nias and staying there. Like, so Nias is this island in Indonesia that's still developing and still quite rural. Like, my parents have a goat. I tease them. I say the goat has replaced me in your life, and it's a little like village life. So it's a nice feeling, but at the same time, I don't know if that's my future. You know what I mean? Because for the longest time, they wanted me to go back and they run a school there. They wanted me to go back and kind of take over the school.
7 decades since Ro's grandfathers fled the disputed Kashmir region, tensions still flare with India and Pakistan embroiled in border skirmishes as recently as February of this year. Ro's family did not become naturalized citizens of Japan and left Kobe for good a few months before the big Kobe earthquake in January 1995. Ro's parents eventually found their way back in India and visit Hong Kong and Singapore regularly to spend time with their children and their grandchildren. For Ro, Singapore is home. He and his wife make it a rule to take their 3 boys to different parts of India and the Philippines every year to help them better understand their roots, something that remained elusive for much of his life until he met up with his high school alumni over the summer, a homecoming that took 25 years in the making.
This summer, we had our 25th high school reunion in Kobe. And we had, 30, 35 people from our class show up in Kobe, Japan. And I never expected to feel this way, but I felt, and all of my former classmates felt, the most comfortable that we have probably in the last 25 years, because you have a group of people who obviously have different nationalities. We went to an international school, but we all share the same isolation, dislocation, if you like. And we were talking about it, and we were there for sort of 2 or 3 days, and we just didn't want those 2 or 3 days to end, because there was a familiarity, there was a very comfortable feeling that didn't require a whole lot of explanation.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed this perspective as Ro, Jessica, Karen, and Fabien shared their stories with us on Maverick Dreamers and Thinkers. If you'd like to find out more about our podcast, go to www.brilliantmp.com for details. Until next time, to all the great dreamers out there, I'm Chloe Cho. Take care and stay tuned.